Hello, and welcome to our program today, Virtual Author Talk, Becoming Lunsford Lane with Dr. Craig Friend. My name is Taylor Wolford, and I am the Outreach Librarian for the State Library of North Carolina Government Heritage Library. This event is hosted by the State Library of North Carolina's Government Heritage Library. To learn more about the State Library and the services that we offer, please check out our website. First, I'd like to get us started today with providing some information about accessibility features for the webinar. To view closed captioning, please use the mouse to hover over the control toolbar on the top or bottom of the screen and click on the closed caption or CC button. Second, select either show subtitle or view full transcript. To make any changes to the caption or accessibility settings, click on the closed caption button and select subtitle settings. A window will open, and in the left pane, click on accessibility and make any changes that you would like. You can also interact in the chat feature today. So for today's webinar, you can use the chat feature to submit questions or request assistance from our staff. If you navigate to the live transcript tab at the bottom of your screen, you can change the chat text size by clicking on subtitle settings to adjust the chat text size. Today's program will be recorded and made available online via the SLNC YouTube channel. If you have a question during the event, feel free to ask your question in the chat. If we are unable to answer it during the presentation, we will answer it during the Q&A session at the end. Additionally, we ask that everyone please keep their cameras off and sound on mute during the presentation. I'd also like to share some information about an upcoming webinar that we are hosting. On August 6th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., the Government Heritage Library will be hosting an Introduction to Vital Records webinar. This will be a virtual webinar over Zoom. The North Carolina Vital Records Office will be joining us to talk about what vital records are and how you can access them. If you're interested in registering for this event, the link is listed on this slide. I will also share the registration link with everyone following today's event, and it has just been shared in the chat if you would like to go ahead and register. And now I am very excited to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Craig Friend. Dr. Friend is a professor of history and public history at NC State University. His research focuses on early American Republic, the Old South, issues of identity and commemoration, gender and masculinity, and death culture. In 2019, Dr. Friend was named NCSU Alumni Association Distinguished Graduate Professor, and he also served in the 2017-2018 President of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Today, I'm very excited that Dr. Friend will be discussing his recent work, Becoming Lunsford Lane, the lives of an American Aeneas. This work is a full biography of Lunsford Lane, a formerly enslaved man from North Carolina who gained freedom for himself and his family and became a noted abolitionist. And now I will hand it over to Dr. Friend to begin today's presentation. And as a reminder, we will be hosting a Q&A after his presentation, so you feel free to pop questions in the chat and we will address those at the end of today's presentation.
Thank you, Taylor, and thank all of you for attending today, and I'm very excited to be with you. I'm going to apologize potentially in advance. I have two miniature schnauzers who are very excited right now, and if they start barking, I may have to interrupt to calm them down. But otherwise, I hope we'll have a nice flowing presentation and conversation today. I thought I would actually frame my presentation as to why I became interested in this subject and sort of the research discoveries I made. And I'll introduce you to Lunsford if you don't know him very well in the process. So, and I'm going to share screen. Let me do that. And it's not showing me the share button. Here we go. Okay. I trust everybody can see my title screen. If not, Taylor can tell me.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so Lunsford Lane, as many of you know, was born in Raleigh in 1803. and I'll fill in more details of his life as we go along. But in 1842, a narrative of Lunsford Lane was written. He dictated it, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. And so historians and individuals in Raleigh who are interested in local history have known of Lunsford at least through 1842, his first 39 years of life. But the questions arose what happened to him afterwards. In 1863, 21 years later, a gentleman, William Hawking, sat down and interviewed Lunsford and wrote a biography of him. But if you're familiar with that biography, what you discover very quickly is that it's a reiteration of the narrative. It adds very little new material, although it does sort of tell us what he's up to during the Civil War at the time this biography was written. But again, that was the extent of our knowledge of Lunsford Lane. Um, oh, and I'm not even skipping my screens. So there's the title page from the narrative, written in 1842. It was issued in three other editions throughout the 1840s. And then there's the title page from the biography written in 1863. It's with this biography that we have our only image of Lunsford. It was drawn by a lithographer in Boston, a very famous lithographic firm. And so there's no reason to doubt that this isn't how he actually looked. And so the themes that this biographer emphasized in the book, if you go look at the book, um, the biographer wrote about Lunsford, but then he would go on these long editorial sermon rants about all sorts of things. At one point, he's basically arguing that all enslavers in the South during the Civil War should be killed. Um, he goes on an editorial in which he frames Lunsford as a Christian preacher, which is really problematic. There's no evidence that Lunsford was a preacher at all, and he questioned his Christian faith throughout his life. Um, and Hawkins also framed Lunsford as an abolitionist. And again, this is somewhat questionable as well, and I'll explain that more in a little bit. And Hawkins also raised the idea that Lunsford was this self-making person. Today, we might use the word entrepreneur, but that wasn't a vogue word at the time, and the concept was just beginning to evolve. So this guy who self-made himself, and these were themes that Hawkins layered on top of Lunsford as he went on these rants in each chapter. And then not much was written about Lunsford. He seemed to disappear entirely from literature until 1896, when a professor over at what would become Duke University, John Spencer Bassett, wrote a book called Anti-Slavery Leaders of North Carolina, and he included a chapter about Lunsford, a biography. And he heavily picked up on these themes. He argued that Lunsford was an entrepreneur, which in the Gilded Age is now a very vogue term, right? Lunsford was this great entrepreneur, and that he was this abolitionist. Even when he lived in the South, he was fighting against slavery. And so there's this exaggeration that takes place as these people are writing biographies of Lunsford, and these exaggerations become embedded in history. So much so that in 2015, Governor McCrory of North Carolina issued a proclamation to Lunsford Lane's great entrepreneurialism, um, which is problematic, and I'll explain more in a little bit. These mythologies about Lunsford become embedded in public history as well. Here's a photo, not a very clear one, of a historic marker in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Lunsford and his family moved eventually. Um, and I'm going to show you the script from it. So here is what it says, and everything I've highlighted in sort of orange yellow is problematic. Some of it isn't even true. For example, a deeply religious man, Lunsford was not. Um, Lunsford could barely write. He certainly did not write his narrative. Through my research, I've determined about the only thing he could write was his name. He never kept a store anywhere in the South, in Raleigh. He did have a store in Boston at one point. Um, and so all of this is problematic, all of this. And even in shorter historic markers like this one, which stands on Edenton Street, a block in front of the State Library, we have problematic words. Lunsford really pushed back against defining himself as an abolitionist. Lunsford was not a great entrepreneur. And he, again, he probably did not write much at all. And so these mythologies become embedded, and it should raise questions for us, not just about Lunsford Lane, but what we do with all of our historical figures, right? How we let our imaginations or our needs to make them relevant to the present or to a certain situation, how those needs redefine who they were as persons. This is particularly problematic when you set out to do a biography, because when you want to do a biography, you want to get to the real person, and sort of peeling through these layers of mythology become part of the process of writing the biography. Now, the reason I even started going down this road of peeling back mythology was this document. This is the deed to the property that he bought in Raleigh. And he bought, and I'll show you a map in a little while to show you where this property was. But in 1838, he bought a house and a small slice of land, which today is behind the Marriott, I believe, on Fayetteville Street. Um, and he bought it for the sum of $53.50, okay, which is in line with other properties that were sold in that same area. So $53.50. Okay. Which is impressive in itself for a free black man in 1838. Except in his narrative, he said that he had paid Mr. Smith $620 and had a house and lot worth $500, which he had promised to take when I shall raise the balance. And so he made this claim that something that he bought for $50 was actually worth $500. And I began to wonder, you know, how did it ever become worth $500? Absolutely not. Okay. In fact, when he finally gets rid of it, it's worth $53. And so it didn't even grow in value over the 3 years that he had it. And so here's an exaggeration, right? And it's an exaggeration that's reiterated in future editions of the narrative, reiterated in the 1863 biography, reiterated in historians' portrayals of Lunsford later on, and it really begins to make you think about the truthfulness of the narrative, which is where everything begins. Okay. In the process of doing this research, I also had to start reconstructing Lunsford's family. This was a really difficult task. As you can imagine, there are very few records that allow for this reconstruction, but I was very fortunate in that I accomplished this, I think, as much as anyone could. You can see Lunsford there at the center of the family tree. His parents were Ned and Clarissa. Ned was first enslaved by Joel Lane and lived out where the Joel Lane house is today. And after Joel Lane passed away in the mid 1790s, Ned was hired out and then eventually purchased by John Haywood, who lived where Haywood Hall is today. And so these two historic properties in Raleigh are actually associated with Ned Lane's history and a little bit with Lunsford's. Um, Clarissa lived across Edenton Street from Ned on the property of John Haywood's brother, Sherwood Haywood, which today is the huge parking lot in front of the State Library. And it's on that piece of property in the kitchen that was detached from the house where Lunsford was born. And so there are his parents. His wife, Martha, was also enslaved out at the property that had been the Joel Lane farm. But by the time she was enslaved there, it had been purchased by William Boylan, and she and her brother were enslaved on that property. Between Martha and Lunsford, there were 10 children born. Only 4 of them lived to adulthood, basically, and only one of them, to my knowledge, had children of his own. One, the eldest son, sort of disappears from history. So I can't say that emphatically that there were no children in this branch of the family. But the only son who lives the only one who lives to have children is William Curtis, who was a twin to Lunsford Jr. And these were William Curtis's offspring. And so actually Lunsford Lane's family bloodline dies out. The last living descendant was Jeanette Lane Cole, who died in 1997. Okay. Um, and I will point out that the epilogue of the book is about these people, Lunsford's descendants, and how Lunsford's life and legacy created opportunity, particularly for the women descended from him, Maud and Jeanette Lane. So here's a map of Raleigh circa 1842, and to give you some sense, here would have been the Lane farm and eventually the Boylan plantation, some distance from downtown. Of course, that's the Joel Lane house there. And here would have been, this is currently Haywood Hall, this other yellow dot. And there's an image of Haywood Hall, but what's particularly exciting about going out to Haywood Hall with Lunsford's story in mind is that the stable behind the house is where his father lived. Ned Lane would have lived in there for a while. Ned Lane also lived in the first floor of the house at some point. And Ned's sister Kate was the cook and the nursemaid, and she lived in this independent kitchen that currently stands behind Haywood Hall. And so here are 2 historic homes of other people who lived at Haywood Hall besides the Haywood family. And so this is the story of Ned Lane here, these 2 dots, Joel Lane House and Haywood House. And then over here is where Sherwood Haywood and his wife, Eleanor, lived, and where Clarissa lived and Lunsford was born. Just the second of 4 households that were owned by Haywood brothers. And so this is very much a community of a white family and a whole lot of black families. And every single one of these households had farms up on Crabtree Creek where they grew the vegetables to feed the families in the town. And so there's a lot of interaction between enslaved laborers up on the farms and in the town at the town estates. And so this is the Haywood community. And by the way, this is where I'm going in my research next, the story of the Haywood community and families. And then here's the state library, just to give you some orientation here. So directly north of the Sherwood Haywood estate. Okay. And so down here in the lower southwestern quadrant of town, this block I blow up for you on the map. And right there would have been Lunsford and Martha's house. It sat facing Cabarrus Street. And you can see that there are multiple other houses. There were 8 buildings on this plot of land in 1842. And some of these are other free black families. Some of these are poor white families, and then some of these are like business extensions. Like here's a stables. This place was a blacksmith shop. And so it's sort of a mixed use block of land there. And then finally, there is the state capitol in 1839, 40, 41. Lunsford was employed at the state capitol working for the governor's office. And it was a very visible position that brought him a lot of attention from people who were jealous or upset that a black man was working in the governor's office. And so some orientation to Raleigh for you. Okay. So the questions about the land deed just started this unraveling for me, this unpeeling. And another area in which the narrative is not entirely forthcoming is that when you read the narrative, you would think that Lunsford Lane, the trials that Lunsford Lane went through as a free man, he went through alone. Um, and that's not true. Lunsford in 1836 purchased himself. It would have been illegal for him to purchase his freedom. He purchased his body from his enslaver, and actually, he carried around papers like a land deed to the property of his body. He traveled in the fall of that year. I said, I don't know what year I said, 1835. He traveled in the fall of that year to New York, where he got some emancipation papers from a county court and returned to North Carolina, which was technically against the law. But he hid in plain sight for 5 years without anybody saying much at all. Um, Lunsford did that in 1835. The following year, an enslaved man named Isaac Hunter followed the exact same pattern, purchased his body, and then traveled to New York in the fall to get emancipation papers with the help of a white merchant. Lunsford had the help of a white merchant in traveling to New York. And then the following year, another man, Waller Freeman, did the exact same thing. And so there are actually three men who find their way to freedom, return to North Carolina because they have families there. Um, um, Lunsford's the only one who purchases a house, but they set up house with their families to some degree, even though all three of these men's families are enslaved. And they do this with the willing help of certain white men in Raleigh of some status, right? Um, and so, um, and so Lunsford, wait a minute, I've lost my place in my notes. Okay. Um, excuse me. And so, um, and so Lunsford, Isaac Hunter, and Waller Freeman live until 1840 without many people harassing them or accusing them of breaking the law. But in 1840, some magistrates decide to enforce the law and tell the three men they have to leave. And as a result, these three men petition the state legislature to stay, to give them exemption from the law. And um, and um, and what transpires from this is a story about the resentment that many white laborers had towards black laborers who they saw as competition, the resentment that a lot of white laborers had towards a white political class and merchant class that had no trouble helping free black men because they did find economic reward for themselves through that process. And so Lunsford, Isaac, and Waller petitioned the state legislature unsuccessfully, and that's a fascinating story in itself. Um, and they're forced to leave Raleigh. And so by the end of January in 1841, all three of them have fled Raleigh with the intention of going up north, raising money, and purchasing their families and saving their families as well. Okay. Um, One thing that makes Lunsford Lane's narrative different from almost every other slave narrative that was eventually written is that it's not about his enslavement. He says very little about his enslavement. It's actually about race. And that's sort of important because the story of Lunsford Lane, the climax of his story is when he returns to get his family and how he avoids a lynch mob and survives a lynch mob. But they're lynching him because of his race, because he had been free for 5 years, right? And we know this because the subtitle of his narrative alludes or states that he's surviving, quote, the crime of wearing a colored skin, right? He's talking about racism in his narrative. And this issue of race becomes sort of central to his story at this point, because not only in the South does race matter to how he lives his life, but as he goes up north, race becomes a central theme of his living. So he goes up to Massachusetts. I'll skip over that. And he goes to Massachusetts and he begins to meet abolitionists to raise money, among them a young abolitionist speaker, Frederick Douglass, who had just begun speaking in July of 1840. And Lunsford shows up and begins speaking in November of 1840. Lunsford was at that moment the far better speaker. He was a great storyteller, so compelling as a storyteller in telling what had happened to him that he raises the money to save his family within 4 months. And he could go back home at that point, but he didn't. Um, Douglass is being groomed to become a great abolitionist speaker during this time. And in fact, at this moment in 1841 into early 1842, Lunsford and Douglass are not speaking partners. They do become speaking partners a little later on. And Douglass, who throughout most of his career opposed purchasing people from their slavery, actually supported Lunsford in his efforts to purchase his family from enslavement in this early period. So Lunsford raises the money. He returns to Raleigh. There's one. He returns to Raleigh where he's grabbed off the train by a lynch mob, as I noted, some of whom were his former neighbors on that block of land that I showed you. Um, this is Lunsford's depiction of it, that they raised me from the ground and carried me on their shoulders. Then I was indeed high and lifted up. Thus I was carried as in a whirlwind towards the gallows. Then my heart sank within me. I thought all was gone. And of course, I could tell you right now how he escaped the mob, but then I wouldn't sell books. So I'm not going to tell you the end of this climatic moment in the first half of the book. Instead, he and his family eventually end up escaping, and they end up in New York City in May 1842. And and they walk into the meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which is meeting in New York at that time for its annual convention. This was clearly a choreographed moment. The way it was written about in the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, is that on looking at the door, we perceived a middle-aged, noble-looking, keen-eyed man coming in with a child in his arms, accompanied by his wife, who carried a still younger child, and his mother, who seemed in the prime of life, and a group of bright-looking children. Room was soon made for them on the platform, where they seated themselves in a very modest and quiet manner. It was Lunsford Lane with his emancipated family. And this was portrayed as Lunsford having fulfilled his destiny of saving his family. And now he was coming in to the meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society. The thing that isn't revealed in the sources is that he and his family were actually in New York for 2 weeks. They had been in there for 2 weeks prior to this moment. and Lunsford had already had association with the abolitionists. And so this was all set up because Lunsford soon took the stage and gave a speech on why it's important to purchase people out of freedom. And so Lunsford is becoming engaged in the sort of internal debates of anti-slavery at this time, and he's very much in the minority. The leadership of anti-slavery opposed purchasing slaves for freedom. And so eventually Lunsford would find himself outside of the abolitionist movement because of his stance on that subject. Okay. The next month in June is when he dictated his narrative. And then over the summer, he welcomed Isaac Hunter and Waller Freeman both to Massachusetts. He even held a fundraiser for Waller Freeman, who made enough money to then go purchase his family. Isaac Hunter had already raised enough money to purchase his family. All three of these men live out their lives in the North, full lives with their full families. Okay. One of the questions I had to ask myself as I was doing this is, how do you measure the impact of a person in history? I mean, people like Frederick Douglass are easy to determine their impact because they wrote so much and so much was written about them. Lunsford wrote hardly anything. And not much was written about him after his death. That sort of persistence of legacy didn't seem to exist. One of the things I did is his narrative was written in 42 and reissued 3 times in the 1840s. And then his biography was written in 1863. And I painstakingly went through census records reconstructing how many people, how many children were named Lunsford after these dates. And it's interesting because the number of Lunsfords in the United States increases in the 1850 census, and you can, backtrack with the birth dates of people. After each of these publications, you see an uptick in the number of children named Lunsford, particularly among Black Americans. But also among some white Americans, some of whom were abolitionist families' children, right? And I know this isn't emphatic, but it did make me think of a quote I had read by Emerson once: if the companions of our childhood should turn out to be heroes and their condition regal, it would not surprise us. All mythology opens with demigods. We call our children and our lands by their names. And there's no doubt that Lunsford became somewhat of a hero, of a demagogue. Throughout the rest of his life, and I'll return to that in just a second. After the family left North Carolina, they settled in Cambridge, Boston first, and then Cambridge, Massachusetts. But Lunsford spent much of the rest of his life seeking out a utopia, a place to live where he felt safe and secure. He tested a place called Hopedale in Massachusetts, which was a utopian community. He had a piece of land in what was eventually called Timbuktu, which was a Black farming community. And he went to Oberlin, Ohio, because many of his former free Black neighbors in North Carolina migrated there. And he's looking for these places where he can live securely and in community with people. Um, and this is just part of his larger pattern of migration for the rest of his life. He's very restless for the rest of his life. And one thing I'll note is all of these dots are where he lived throughout his life, beginning in Raleigh, right there. The ones, and there's a list of them on the right, the ones that are underlined are when he basically abandoned his family. One of the sadder parts of the rest of his story is that his marriage begins to fall apart, becomes very weakened as the children, some of the children die, other children grow up and leave the home, and his relationship with Martha suffers as a result. And so the places that are underlined, he went alone. and left his family behind. The asterisks that you see next to the names are the number of properties he owned in each of those places. And I will note, referring to his entrepreneurialism, that that in only one of those places, Raleigh, was he not foreclosed upon. He never paid any of his mortgage loans, and he seems to have not paid off any loans at all that were non-mortgage as well. Lunsford did return to Raleigh in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. He was going to set up a freeman's school down near New Bern. It was said of him when he returned that the Black community came out in full force. And that not alone because he was a martyr, but because he had been a sort of leader and prince among them. His mythology, his legacy had been sustained in Raleigh even in his absence. Among those who came out were people like Anna Julia Haywood and Charles Norfleet Hunter, both of whom at that time were children under 10 years old, who were on Haywood estates, had been born enslaved on one of those Haywood estates, but by 1865, when Lunsford showed up, were free Black children. And during his time in North Carolina, he preached what we would call rational liberty. He preached that, and this was his philosophy throughout his life, that newly freed people had freedom in its truest and best sense, not a mere license to do as we please, but to be profitably employed so as to benefit the state as well as ourselves. Rational freedom was a philosophy that in your freedom, you have obligations to take care of others and to share that freedom as much as you can. Okay. I'm about to wrap up. One mystery that really vexed me is that most historians had basically said that Lunsford died in 1863 after the biography was written. It took me a long time to find him, but eventually I discovered that he had died in Manhattan in a tenement house in 1879 and was buried in New York Bay Cemetery, which is over in Jersey City. And this image gives you an idea of the space in which he's buried. You can see the markers all around this part of the cemetery, but there's this area that's bare, and he's buried there, 3 plots away from Martha. So the distance that had come between them in life followed them into death. And eventually, 3 of their grandchildren as infants and toddlers were buried between them. But this part of the cemetery was for people to bury the deceased, and they could afford a plot, but they couldn't afford a tombstone. And so it's really impossible to find the exact spot where Lunsford and Martha are buried there. Okay. Should you be interested in buying the book, that's what it looks like. And there's a QR code, or you can just go to the University of North Carolina Press, and I strongly encourage you to use this discount code for 30% off, 01 Social 30, or it may be 10 Social 30. Don't blame me for the era. Just try both if one doesn't work. That's the price of it at the University of North Carolina Press, or you can get it on Amazon for $29. Okay, so thank you very much. I've enjoyed sharing with you, and I'm trying to get out of this screen. So thank you. Am I still in the screen?
I see you, Dr. Friend.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Friend, for such a wonderful and informative presentation. We're going to now open up to questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please drop them in the chat and we will get started on the Q&A portion of today's webinar. I do have a question just to get us started today. So Dr. Friend, when we were chatting before the webinar started today, you had mentioned that this was a 10-year-long project. So I'm interested if you could expand on and talk a little bit more about how you approached researching for this book and what type of resources you access while research and writing for the book.
So, as you can imagine, it was a very difficult subject to research, particularly when people don't leave letters behind. I found nothing that his children had left. I'm not even sure they were educated enough to write memoirs or to write letters that would have contained that. And so I spent a lot of time looking through governmental records, census records, transactional records, store records, which is why that map I showed you that had all of those dots on it, I went to every single one of those places because I was visiting city halls and county courts, looking for records that would reveal to me what Lunsford was up to in these spaces. I'm very fortunate in that the Liberator newspaper and other northern newspapers were sort of obsessed with black abolitionist lives at this time, and were including in their papers the stories they could tell about these individuals who were speaking, who were traveling across the North. Lunsford in particular, because he was very early on this sort of entertaining narrative teller, a storyteller, unlike other abolitionists who were out there preaching about the evils of racism or the evils of slavery. Lunsford never denounced slavery and he never denounced slaveholders. In fact, he suggested that we should be empathetic towards slaveholders. He never denounced racism. And so he was somebody that a lot of audiences felt safe with because they didn't feel like they were being preached at, which is something that people like Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnett and other speakers were facing, William Wells Brown faced when they approached audiences. And so the newspapers covered Lunsford a lot as well. But this was very much putting together a jigsaw puzzle with 10,000 pieces. Yes. So,
Thank you. We have a couple other questions popped in the chat. Any idea where the name Lunsford came from?
um, so his father named him Lunsford after a guy named Lunsford Long, who was a cousin of Joel Lane and would come meet with Joel Lane. And Lunsford Long was from Halifax County. Lunsford, it's sort of a really unfortunate name because Lunsford Long was terrible towards his enslaved people. And so Lunsford Lane was named after this person who was not really that decent a human. So yes, yeah.
Another question in the chat, Dr. Friend. If Lunsford Lane could not read or write much, what would his role have been in the Freedmen's School after the Civil War?
Oh, that's a good question. He was not going to be a teacher. He was sent down to be sort of the principal. And I should explain, this was not a freedman school like we would have found in Raleigh at the time. It's a plantation school. And he was wrapped up with a guy named Horace James, who was a friend of his father in New England. And Horace James had two plantation schools in Eastern North Carolina. And a plantation school is where the people go to school in the evening, but then they work the farm all day long to make profit for whoever owns the plantation. And Lunsford, if we're going to use this term, I did not find this term in the research anywhere, but Lunsford was going to be sort of like an overseer. He was going to oversee the labor of all of these free black students who were adults and children during the day, and then there were teachers who were going to teach them in the evening. And this plantation school closes fairly quickly. It's not open that long because Horace James is arrested by the military because there's a murder on his plantation. And when Horace James is Horace James is arrested, Lunsford got out of North Carolina as quickly as he could. He did not stay around to see what happened. Yes.
Thank you. Another question in the chat. What was Lunsford Lane's role in the governor's office? Are there any surviving documentation related to this role?
Actually, the second, yes, there is documentation related to what Lunsford was doing in the governor's office because when the state legislature decides to not allow him to stay in North Carolina, they debate whether he should be paid his salary or not, and they investigate and they fight over whether he was paid appropriately for 3 years. Pro-slavery individuals claim that he never should have been paid as much as he was paid. He had a monthly salary, basically. He was hired by C.C. Battle, who was the governor's personal secretary, and Battle was so overwhelmed by the demands of the office that he needed somebody who could be a courier, who could be a doorman and keep people out of council meetings that Battle was involved in. And there is some reason to believe that Lunsford was, because he had access to government documents and everything, was learning how to read better during that time as well. He also learned how to read a little bit while he was a member of the First Baptist Church in Raleigh. Um, and so Lunsford is finding ways to learn how to read. And I'm pretty certain, although I have no evidence to verify this, that Lunsford had a good reading literacy, but that his writing is where he faltered. Yeah.
That's fascinating. That was an excellent question, and thank you for sharing. I did not realize in Lunsford Lane's life that he had worked in the governor's office either. I don't know that that
Yes.
is something that's more commonly known about him. So that was a
Well,
really
and I
interesting
will note to
discovery.
tag on to that is that we attribute to Lunsford that he's selling tobacco to legislators, and that's his entrepreneurialism, and that's where he made his money. No, he made his money with a full-time job in the governor's office. That was his primary source of income. He didn't need to be this sort of on the street barterer that we make him out to be in the mythology.
Wow, that is fascinating. So a couple more questions. Thank you all for these questions. These are wonderful. What was one of your most surprising or meaningful discoveries you made during your research for the book?
Well, I mean, the most emotional discovery I made is when I went to New York Bay Cemetery and discovered there was no tombstone. And I'll just be honest, I sat down on the ground and cried. I mean, it was like I had spent years with this person, right? And biographers create a relationship with this, and we have mixed emotions about them. At one point, I thought he was the greatest human who ever lived. At another point, I'm like, I can't believe he treated his wife the way he did, which was rather dismissive and patriarchal. Um, so I really had this emotional connection, and it just shattered me when I finally found him. It was like this great relief, only to be let down that I could never really find him, right? I had no idea where he was on that plot of land. Um, the sort of one of the most surprising and joyous moments in the research was when Lunsford came south to help set up that Freedman School. When he returned to Worcester, which is where Worcester, Massachusetts, which is where the family lived at that time. The house he left behind, the family was no longer there. Martha, his wife, and two of the older daughters had purchased land nearby and had moved. And and I was like, wow, right? I mean, here are three free black women in the North engaging in real estate. And they bought the land from a white woman, and eventually they sold the land to white women. And here's this network of women who are engaging in property purchases. And in some ways, and Martha made a profit off from the property she purchased. In some ways, she was a far more successful entrepreneur than Lunsford ever was, at least when it came to property. But of course, we give her no credit at all. She just sort of disappears into the shadows of history. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's one excellent point that you made there is in terms of conducting historical inquiries and going through all of these numerous records that you went through. At a certain point, you also start to see these as real living people, and the emotional connection that you develop with the people that you're researching as a historian is very real and very tangible, the more that you uncover about their lives. So I think that was something really that I wanted to emphasize, both with
Well,
your work
thank
and
you.
the work I've done as a historian as well. A lot of other questions. So I think you, if I remember correctly, you said that Lunsford's female descendants is mentioned in the epilogue of your work. Is there more to say about these women? And also, in the process of your research, did you come across any written biographies or written texts that speak to their experiences at this time?
Right. And yeah, there was very little written about his descendants
Okay.
over the following century plus. Um, Jeanette Lane Cole, who's his last living descendant, is a fascinating historical character in herself. Um, and it feels weird calling her a historical character because I was certainly alive in 1997 while she was dying, right? Um, but and I'm not going to remember the name of the school. She ended up teaching at a historic black college for 30 years, 30 plus years. It was in southwestern Virginia. It has since closed, and but she was like this loved professor, and she becomes part of the mythology. Thank you. Someone just put St. Paul's College. Thank you. She was part of this mythology at the college, where students just talked about her in the newspapers, and she was this character. And as a younger woman, she had been a tennis player in New Jersey as she grew up. And so as she got old, the wear and tear on her legs as a younger woman really took a toll on her, and she really struggled to walk. And and the students talked about that. And so there are reminiscences by students in which they address, their memories of her, which were great to run across. But that was as close to biography as I found for any descendant. Yeah.
Alrighty, we have another question. There is a shout out to you, Dr. Friend, and thank you for your work.
Who's shouting out to me?
Antonio
Thanks for
also
the shout
mentioned,
out. Okay.
they also mentioned Lunsford, Isaac, and Waller in their dissertation, which is wonderful. So I believe you already covered this, but are there any living descendants of Lunsford Lane? And if so, were you able to get into contact with them?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Actually, about 5 years ago or 6 years ago, I was talking to a group, and two women came up afterwards and said, we're descendants of Lunsford Lane. And I hated to tell them, in fact, I did. I hated to tell them that there were no living descendants of Lunsford Lane as far as I could tell, right? There is that one branch that sort of fades out. But what's really sort of important here is there's a guy born in 1845 in Wake County, who's named Lunsford Lane. And he's named after this Lunsford Lane. His parents knew Ned, had served on the Joel Lane farm with Ned as children. And they had this young man named Lunsford Lane. And this Lunsford Lane, I think, is the ancestor of the women who came up to me. He eventually becomes the carriage driver for the mayor of Durham, and he works in a tobacco factory over there eventually. And coincidentally, in 1898, I believe, 1895, John Spencer Bassett, the professor from Duke University or Trinity College that I mentioned early on, goes to the state fair, and there's a guy standing there offering horse rides with a sign that says "Horse Rides by Lunsford Lane." And Spencer Bassett is very confused and says, "Do you know the original Lunsford Lane?" And he goes, "Yeah, he's my uncle," but he wasn't. Right? This guy had no idea who Lunsford Lane was because he'd never met him, probably. So anyway, there are other Lunsford Lanes, and I actually talk about that briefly in the book. These people who are named Lunsford, which I alluded to earlier, but particularly these people who are Lunsford Lanes, and sort of the legacy of that name. Yes.
Great. Thank you all so much for these questions. We have one final question I think we'll have time to cover before we wrap up for today. And I just want to take the time again to thank you, Dr. Friend, for this lovely presentation and for these really thorough and well thought out responses to these questions. So another question we have in the chat is, were you able to discover more information on his wife, Martha's family members on the Boylan property?
Yeah, Martha's brother, I know Martha's brother lived with her. I don't know his name. But if you look at the naming patterns of Lunsford and Martha's children, every single one of them is named after a family member. And so my suspicion is that her brother's name was William, the lone boy, whose name I couldn't figure out where its origin. Um, William eventually, one of the reasons Martha wants to escape this farm is William was shot in the back while trying to escape, and he's disabled for much of the rest of his life. But beyond that, I was not able to unravel Martha's genealogy. But I will admit that I did not make much of an effort there because that was not my primary purpose in dealing with Martha and her brother. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Friend. And that concludes today's webinar. To all of our viewers, I want to say thank you for joining us today, and your feedback is very important to us. So we ask that you please take a few minutes today to complete our survey. We want to hear what you have to say, and we do use participant feedback to inform future outreach events, including webinars like this. So that concludes today's webinar with guest speaker, Dr. Craig Friend. Thank you for joining us today, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.